Hey guys, it's Bella, and I just want to have an informal chat with you guys about something that I'm quite passionate about, but something which I understand is a thing which is foreign, unknown, and maybe even fearful to a lot of people who have a amateur and a passion, but also a very passionate and valuable interest in medieval and ancient history. I was watching this morning this talk by Daniel Padilla Peralta, sorry if I'm butchering his name, on the haunted house of classics. I'm going to put a link to this talk in the description, and I highly recommend all of you check it out. He's very eloquent and he does a good job of bringing up and talking about the absences within scholarship of classical history. And what this means is he's talking about the history of classical scholarship, and he points out how people haven't talked about how classical studies have been used to uphold racist and imperialist ideologies. That's all of this means. But basically, this speech by him is a valuable example of what can be gained by applying critical perspectives in the study of medieval and classical texts. So, what I mean by this is he talks about a book on classics written by this guy who will hopefully come up on my screen shortly. Um, this guy whose name is, although it's quite blurry, his name is John Edwin Sundys, and this is a portrait of him here. The point being, Sandys wrote a history of classical scholarship in which he never mentions the contribution of any black or just non-white scholars, of which there have been a fair few in classics who have contributed valuable things, but also he's not critical of the ways in which classics as an institution has helped imperial ideologies, for instance, in the colonial era. He doesn't ask very interesting questions, which might provide fruitful avenues of study for the classics, like why in certain periods, particularly colonial periods, were classicists especially interested in matters of Greco-Roman slavery and maritime law, etc. Sandys doesn't ask these questions. He's more focused on a sort of abstract humanist idea of the classical text as a thing needing to be rescued from antiquity and from obscurity. So I'm talking in a very roundabout way about why it's valuable to bring critical perspectives to reading medieval texts and why it's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think I'm going to do a very good job of it because I'm a bit tired and I'm just waking up, but we'll give it a go as best we can. My argument, in a nutshell, is that if you think of what classics is as an institution, and classics is a bit easier to talk about because it's so defined. If you have something in classics like the Loeb Classical Library, and in fact, if you go to any bookstore, you'll probably find the Loeb Classics. You'll see a bookshelf full of the Loeb Classical Library. They look like this. The Latin is in red, the Greek is in green, and they have a very small section on medieval as well, which is in blue. I don't quite know why the medieval is in blue, but whatever. And what these usually are, it's a standardized way of presenting classical texts. So they'll have the Latin or Greek original with a facing page translation in modern English. And here's an example of what it looks like on the page. And this defines what the classical period is. If we take this bookshelf and assume that it contains the whole Loeb Classical Library, what we have here is a delimitation of these are classical texts, right? And other texts are not included. So For instance, Lux Aureus, I don't believe is included within the Low Classical Library. I may be wrong on this, and if I am, somebody correct me. But the point is, these texts define a period of classical Latin and Greek literature and excludes literature that lies outside of this from study. And what this means is that you only have a certain number of texts to read. If we assume that these texts here are all the Latin that there is, well, let's guess that there's maybe 100 200 there. You have about 200 texts, right, in the Latin section, which I will be more familiar with than the Greek. And the point of, say, critical race theory perspectives, or just queer perspectives, feminist perspectives, is that for 500 years of classical scholarship, from Petrarch all the way to this guy, and from Erasmus as well, although that's not a picture of Erasmus, from Erasmus all the way to Sandys, these classical texts that we just looked at here have been studied only by people with a similar background to this guy. We all know that our background influences how we perceive the world, and I think it also influences how we perceive medieval and classical texts in Latin or Greek. And the point of a critical race theory perspective on these matters would be that people have been looking at these small number of texts. Again, look at that small number of texts. People have been looking at that from the perspective of people with a similar background to Sandy. And this is they're going to bring in the buzzwords that people get afraid by or put off by. It is, at the end of the day, the perspective of somebody who is white, presumably cisgender, presumably heterosexual, usually upper middle class, and that's something that you guys noted a lot, who were fans of History Debunked, responding to our first discussion, because you guys noted that you essentially told me to check my class privilege, and you acknowledged that or you're pointing out that my perspective is influenced by my class background. And you were engaging in a kind of standpoint epistemology, saying that because my perspective is a middle class one, I don't have as good a grip on what's real as people who are from, say, a working class background. But this is exactly what people in critical theory perspectives are saying should be done with classical texts. So if we were to apply the same logic, you guys were essentially saying, who were leaving comments about my class background in our discussions, my discussion with Simon, you guys were saying that I should bring in a critical perspective from a working class perspective that is not my own to look at the same events, say the matter of whether English, whether the Old English period should be termed Old English, Early Medieval, or Anglo-Saxon. And I should bring in a critical perspective from a different class background. This is exactly what people are saying in relation to the classical text. People are saying that for 500 years, people of this background have been studying classical texts. People from these backgrounds need to consider other perspectives that might influence how a text is read in order to find something new. Because at the end of the day, this limited number of texts have been studied for over 500 years. And I feel like the chances of probably everything has already been said that either needs to be said or which can be read in a lifetime about these texts. And one of the only ways to get something new, I think, out of them is to come at them with new evidence and with new perspectives. That's what it means to bring theoretical perspectives to bear in reading the classical text. I'm going to try to do more videos simply showing what I mean by applying critical perspectives to the classical text. And I'm hoping that you guys will watch these videos and gain something out of them. I have one that I uploaded very recently, yesterday. I provocatively entitled it An Ostrogothic Transbian, a queer reading of Enodius's poem. And I highly recommend you check that out, because what I'm doing there is I'm taking a perspective informed by present day queer theory, and I am reading a classical, well, arguably, or medieval text by Magnus Felix Enodius, and I'm saying that because, first of all, I'm saying we can draw parallels between what's happening then and what's happening now. I'm saying that looking at things through a queer lens allows us to see things that might not otherwise be there. So with Uxoricula, the person Enodius is critiquing in that poem, I say in the video how, from the perspective of modern trans theory, in which we know of people who experience gender dysphoria and present a different social role, we can understand that this person may well have been somebody who performed a feminine social role despite being assigned male at birth, whereas somebody without that perspective might not be able to, might have a very different view of what the text is. They may say that this is a man, or this is a gay man, or they may just say that this is a degenerate man. And I feel that it's not that any of these perspectives is necessarily right or wrong. It's just that that's saying something new. Saying that this person is a trans feminine person is giving a new and original way to look at things. Whereas saying that Uxorkula is simply a man is does not give as much more beyond what Enodus has already said, and which probably any classical scholars writing on Enodius's poem about Uxorkula in previous centuries would have said. So I think I've been rambling a bit here, but my point is that try not to get put off by people saying that, oh, we're going to look at Cicero, or we're going to look at Homer, we're going to look at Virgil through a post-colonial, neo-feminist, postmodernist, critical race theory perspective. I think in many ways this is valuable. I said in my last video about heritage how I feel that English heritage is declining, not because of any deliberate or external force, but simply because people can't be bothered. And to be completely fair to people in regards to classics, if all that is being said or has been said about classics is coming from this perspective, people are already quite familiar with this perspective, and they will likely have heard most of this stuff already. So bringing new perspectives to the table and looking at classical and medieval texts in a new way, I think might incentivize more people to study these texts and get interested in the periods associated with them. So I would encourage you guys to keep an open mind when you hear about critical race theory, queer theory, trans theory, gender theory, any of these theories, class theory even, Marxist theory being applied to studying medieval texts or ancient texts, because these are exciting new avenues. It doesn't mean that they're all necessarily correct. There can be critical race perspectives that, or Marxist perspectives, whatever, that I even would disagree with as somebody broadly sympathetic to these theoretical frameworks. But even if you disagree with them, I think you should recognize and acknowledge that these perspectives are providing new ways of talking about text, which otherwise would be very stale and otherwise would be lost to the dust that gathers on them from being on the shelves for so long. So that's a summary of my thoughts in a very rambling way about the value of theoretical perspectives for classics. So thank you guys for watching, and I will put out a video soon. I'm probably going to record it right after this, applying critical race theory to another poem by Magnus Felix Nordis, because my argument will be that critical race theory will give us a better perspective on Magnus Felix Nordis's poem, and it will help us understand, in a new and perhaps more accurate way, the relationship between Goths and Romans in Ostrogothic Italy. So I'm hoping you guys will join me for that, and otherwise, I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.